Well, hello and welcome back to the Alternative Ideas podcast. I am your co-host, David Rethemeyer, and I am joined by my co-host, Jonathan Brush. Jonathan, if people are new here, give them a little bit of an explainer of what we're talking about here in this podcast.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. This is a conversation between two people coming at this from slightly different generational backgrounds here, discussing AI. Our contention is that AI is actually a pretty big deal, that this is the kind of technology that is likely to be culture shifting and changing, and that educated, well-informed people should think about this. But perhaps the biggest alternative idea here is that we believe that there's some things that are kind of scary with AI, but there's also some things that are very exciting. And like almost any other big technological change, there's going to be a little bit of both. And so this is a place where we hope to have some thoughtful discussion. And our goal is to sort of spark some thinking on your part so that you can trend towards the stuff that we think is exciting and maybe be aware of the stuff that may be a little bit terrifying. And I think on this podcast, David, we have a little bit of both. So
I think that we do too. So we tried to strike a balance with that. Some weeks are a little bit more towards one side or the other, but I think we'll see how this one goes, because we'll jump right into the first topic that you brought in here, which is one of the biggest concerns that tends to be around artificial intelligence, especially the large language models that we have right now, is data collection and how data is used. So, Jonathan, you have found an interesting story on that.
Yeah, I feel like the last 2 weeks have been a little bit more optimistic, or a little bit like kind of, hey, we're going to figure this out. And this is not a doomsday podcast by any means, but there are definitely, I think the topics that we looked at this week have a little more caution in them and are worth kind of throwing up some flags and saying, hey, we should pay attention here. So yeah, this is an article from The Verge, and the headline here is Google confirms it's training Bard on scraped web data too. Now, I think there's some really interesting things here. So basically, Bard, so this is, okay, this is a little bit of an annoyance factor for me. You know, we have these privacy policies. You have to say yes to privacy policy to make things work. They're written in, 4 points font or something like that. They're deliberately vague and opaque and all these kinds of things. And at this point, you just sort of automatically push yes. And yet, when you do that, you're saying yes to a lot of stuff, right, David?
I heard someone say that the most commonly told lie in the 21st century is I have read and agree to the terms and conditions.
Right. And it annoys me because I'm a kind of person who likes to read stuff, and I almost never read those because, I actually try, but then I sort of check it out after a while. And then I'm annoyed because I'm big enough to understand that I did say yes and it's on me, but I'm also big enough to understand that it was deliberately written to be annoying. Not to be annoying, but to be hard to understand. This is one of those places where you kind of chuckle a little bit. Google tried to sort of quietly slip this in, and then some news organizations picked it up. Because it was quiet, they made a big deal of it, which I think is what they got what they deserved. And the point here is that they're saying, oh yeah, Bard is actually scraping data to use its language model. Now, there's a lot of implications to that. It's not a big surprise that Google doesn't really like your privacy and will take and steal all your stuff. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. But what this does do is that, yeah, I could publish a blog post and you could come along, copy and paste that and repost it somewhere. But that's probably going to be found out. And at least it would be pasted sort of in its entirety. So while it's possible to steal my intellectual property that way, it's also easier to track, and it's still kind of the block of text that I wrote to some extent, right? This is kind of an interesting, Bard is going to come along, read my blog post, and then take information from that blog post, repurpose it with a bunch of other information, use it then to formulate its answers to something else. And I don't know, David, give me your impression of this. I can't quite decide if that is the same as you reading my blog post, reading 10 other blog posts, and then writing a blog post on what you've learned together. That's perfectly fine. That's how I probably wrote my blog post in the first place. Or if this feels weirdly different, like Google is benefiting from Bard stealing my ideas, but then obfuscating them in such a way that I can't really tell that they're my ideas anymore, but I had a piece of that. Yeah, there's a little bit of both ways there. So I don't know if you've got a perspective on that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about putting any sort of content out on the internet is the fact that once you put it out there, there is just so much that can be done with it. And just the rise of AI and large language models has just put such a spotlight on what internet content can get used for and how your intellectual property, as soon as you put it out there on the internet, just has, you can try to protect it in only so many different ways if you are not wanting it to be used in certain ways. But at the end of the day, the internet, once you put something out there, you can't take it back. It's out there in the internet permanently for anyone to see, anyone to look at, and for anyone to manipulate and do what they want with, essentially. And so that's just sort of the tricky part, because on the one hand, you kind of signed up for whatever you put out on the internet to be used for whatever people want it to be used for. So I kind of feel that way to an extent, but there's also just the fact that these big companies are, even if they're in just a roundabout way, making money off of it and using and improving their products. These companies are improving their products based on work that you put out there. And in basically any other industry, that would be something that you would be compensated for. Is if you contributed something that made a product better, then you would have some sort of compensation for it. But yeah, then again, it's just with the internet, as soon as you put anything out there, you're basically saying, companies can use whatever I put on here for their profit and for their benefit. Like, if you have signed up for any sort of social media website, then you are automatically signing up to allow them to use any sort of information that they have collected on you to advertise to you and to make money off of advertisers. And so I agree. I see what you're saying in that it feels different. It feels weird in that knowing that something that you have put out there on the internet can contribute to just this AI model. It's a very strange feeling, and I can see why people have a problem with it, especially creatives who work for thousands and thousands of hours on some of their projects. And yet at the same time, if you're going to be putting things out in an internet marketplace, it's kind of just the reality that you have to deal with at this point.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to I don't have a good answer here. So if you're listening to this, I'll just kind of show the spoiler alert and say I don't know that I've got a conclusion. To some extent, what AI is doing is precisely what humans do, and I have done myself. Mm-hmm. So I would go so far as to say, both from a practical reality as well as a theological position, I would say that nothing that I have published, talked about, spoken about, taught, trained, passed on to my children, spoken to in audiences, taught in the classes that we do is original. Mm-hmm. And so, in other words, I would say, theologically, God is the creator. So he originally created stuff. And so what I do is I take things that God already created and rearrange it. And that is that is acting in God's image, being made in God's image, right? From a practical standpoint, I don't think there's anything such as original art, right? I mean, it's all a reflection of something else.
Yeah.
And so, this is precisely what I do. I read a lot of books. I listened to a lot of podcasts. I've watched a lot of YouTube channels. I've talked to a lot of people. I've experienced a lot of things. I guess experiencing the things, we'll take those out. So let's take that one out and go back and do that list again. I have read a lot of books. I have read a lot of articles. I have researched a lot on the net, on the web. I have listened to podcasts. And when I publish, speak, teach, and write, it is a synthesis of all those things. There are ideas that I would not have if it hadn't been for authors that I've read and people that I've learned from. Now, when I copy them directly, of course, you have to cite them or that's plagiarism. But, I would say that everything that we teach in Unbound, which is where David and I work, every class I teach there, that all has its genesis in something that I read someplace else, right? If it's a direct quote, we attribute it. But other than that, it's a synthesis of all those things together. That's the original creation, the way we've mixed, the way I've mixed all those different things. That's the way humans work. So what is it that I don't like about the AI doing it? It feels like, and I'm going to take a shot here, but I'm not sure if this is the right way. If somebody reads my stuff and then uses it and republishes and synthesizes it and all those things, which is what I would have done, then I feel like they're an entity out there that I can both learn from and interact with. When something like an AI does it, it seems very impersonal and very large and very hard to respond to. So in many ways, if you're an author, right, and somebody reads your books and then teaches other people or builds a platform using things they've learned in your books, that's a form of flattery and it's exciting. And I would say that I can now interact with that person and learn from them and we can kind of ramp things up. But if Bard comes along and steals my stuff and uses it like 1 little percent or one little piece or one little thought right here, spread out over a large course of things, I never can really see where my ideas went. And I don't have that opportunity to interact with somebody. Is that different from if I published a book, it became a New York Times bestseller, and millions of people around the world were taking pieces of it and using it? I guess functionally, no. But
it's just very
feels
impersonal.
Different, right? So it's an interesting thing. So anyhow, this article was interesting from that standpoint. It immediately took me down this path. And of course, now you see a reaction. The last paragraph here is that Twitter and Reddit have recently taken drastic measures to try and prevent other companies from freely harvesting their data, but it's negatively affected the core Twitter and Reddit user experiences. And so I think this sets us up for something we'll talk about a little bit here, David, in terms of like, how do you manage all this kind of stuff? But it was an interesting reality for me to go, I cannot put my thumb on and say why this is different from what I am doing. And is that why it bothers me, or is there some other reason? So anyhow.
Yeah, and what I think a final point on this is that I think this just has interesting implications for the knowledge economy now, too. Right. Is that for so long, information has been just such a commodity, and where you get your information, the quality of your information, and the method in which you're getting information, all of that is a huge part of our economy, and has just had to change so much with the internet, because now with just global communication being almost completely democratized, now the economy of information had to drastically change. And now we have these systems that are allowing us to take all of this different information, all of this information that is from all over the place that has been spread out over the internet, and condense it and is able to interpret it in these different ways and essentially reprocess so much of that information. Now just the knowledge economy is, I think, going to have to adjust in some really interesting ways. And frankly, I have no idea what that is entirely going to look like going forward. But that was just the thought I had, that that's going to be big.
Yeah, that's we're going to go a little off path here, and we'll get to your article in a second here, David. But this crosses into, those of you who might have hear us or know us from Unbound will hear some familiar phrases in this knowledge-based economy. And we use a lot of language in Unbound, both for our students and in our public podcasts and presentations and speaking events. We argue quite extensively that we are no longer in an answers-based economy, that we're in a questions-based reality. We don't say economy, we actually use paradigm. We're no longer in an answers-based paradigm, we're in a questions-based paradigm. And what we say by that is that, the entire system of education that you are used to is predicated on an answers-based paradigm, which is you don't have the information and you need to go to a specialized place to absorb that information. And our argument has been that that's a completely unrealistic, that does not match the reality of the day. The reality of the day is that you have access to almost the entirety of the world's information. So now it's about asking questions and then sorting the answers and then applying them. But David, you're bringing up an excellent point, which is in some ways it's a step removed and then doubled down to that, because now we're seeing the advent of a technology that can actually ask the questions. And so your job and the learning is to question the answer. So it's not answers based anymore. The entirety of the world's knowledge is available. It's not asking the question and finding the answers. You can now get an AI to do that. It's the ability to ask a question of the answer the AI gives you to check A, if it's accurate, and B, then the key becomes the application. And so there's an interesting argument there for what it means to be human, because it has truncated a process down to the point, which is where the point was all the time anyhow. So David, let me take a little shot here and see if I can think this through. Okay. So my grandfather worked in the mill as a millwright. And so a millwright is a person who has specialized training and education to work the mills in this is a steel mill, to do very precision work. And so for my grandfather to get to that point, he had to work in the mill. he had, in his case, he never actually finished high school even, but he was very good at math. So he had picked that up from his educational experiences. Then he had experience in the mill. Then he took, and to his surprise, passed the millwright exam. So he showed that he had knowledge. And then the knowledge that he had learned, he went to the mill shop and the people there taught him more information. And then he was able to apply that information and run the mill. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
However, what I described sounds like somebody's career, but from the other end, the only thing that's important is the last section of that story. He ran the mill, right? Everything before that is just preparation for that piece. He doesn't actually deliver value to the steel mill until he runs the mill to accomplish the things that the steel mill needs to accomplish with the mill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so everything up to that point is I don't know about wasted effort, but from a productivity standpoint, from a impact the world standpoint, this is all somebody who doesn't know knowing. This is information that already exists, going from already existing to one particular person so that that person can apply it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that might be interesting to think about, listeners, is that what AI is doing is it keeps shortening that lead up and it gets us to the point. So in other words, that information that exists is now automatically being sorted, automatically being categorized, automatically being kind of sifted. But the part that is still absolutely essential is when the human takes it and applies it to the problem. Mm-hmm. And in a millwright, you would actually take your hands and physically manipulate something to do that, right? But there is still an essential piece here, even in the intellectual world, where a human has to say, how do I take this information and apply it to this problem so I get the solution that I want? And that requires a very human touch of understanding what the problem is, what the outcome is desired, and what qualifies as a good way to achieve that desired outcome. There's an interesting thought experiment that people say the problem with AI is if you embodied AI in a robot, like a Boston Dynamics robot, and you told the AI, take this tea to the person who ordered it, without thinking through the rest of the implications, the AI would stomp a puppy, kill a kitten, run over a child, and break a window if they needed to deliver the tea to the person that ordered it, right? In other words, a human would step around the puppy, pet the cat, say nice things to the child, and walk around the window instead of going through it to deliver the tea, knowing that the tea is subservient to and less important than killing puppies, damaging kittens, hurting kids, and breaking windows. But the AI doesn't know that unless you teach it. And so there's an aspect here where that's a sort of simplified black and white example of the fact that it's not just about knowing what the question is and applying the answer to it. It's also knowing what is an appropriate way to apply the knowledge to fix the to achieve the solution. And that is still, at least to date, and absent whatever the general learning thing or whatever, absent some really more sophisticated AI than we have now, that is still an essential human thing. So, okay, rabbit trail ended, David. And maybe actually the little dark story at the end with the AI stepping on puppies is a good lead into your story, because you've got a pretty, how did you characterize it? Sort of a extremely weird and unsettling. So what was extremely weird and unsettling? The UN, okay. I will admit that the UN is almost always extremely weird and unsettling to me in many ways, but go for it, David.
So in this particular instance, what has happened is that there is a United Nations technology agency that, for reference, I will have links to my sources down below here in the show notes. A technology agency that's assembled a group of robots that is humanoid-ish looking. They are designed to mimic human faces, structures, and have human facial expressions.
It does look like a doll's horror show type. This looks like the setup for a horror movie, to be honest.
It really does. It really does.
Yeah, there's one in particular that's just very creepy. So anyhow, carry on.
Yeah, they're weird looking. But they had a news conference this last week where they invited a bunch of reporters to ask these robots that have AI about the future of artificial intelligence. So basically, this was a room full of reporters that were asking AI questions about the implications of AI with their creators sitting there with them. So you can already imagine just how fascinating of a scenario this was, frankly.
That's an interesting choice of words, David. Continue on.
Yeah. And so, for one thing, I would just like to note, as somebody who works a little bit in production, if you end up watching the video of it, the United Nations production team leaves some things to be desired. I'll leave that comment where it is. But
apparently they just don't have the budget, David. It's a lack of funding. So.
Right. Yes, that's definitely the case. And so so it's like this 40-minute video if you want to take a look at it. But what was really interesting is that it's not too much that's new, aside from just getting to see in real time some of these reporters getting answers and seeing some of the creators respond to some of these answers. I think the most interesting question that was asked was that there was a reporter who asked one of the AIs, hey, we've seen a lot of inconsistencies in our politicians and our world leaders. Do you think that humanoid robotic artificial intelligence could do a better job of essentially like being like world leaders? And the artificial intelligence basically said, yes, I can see an outcome in which artificial intelligence would be able to do a better job at leadership, because we were able to be more impartial and have less of the human biases. And so what was fascinating to watch, though, is that the creator of that robot and essentially the robot's maker was sitting there next to them. And essentially after the robot gave that answer, he said, I'm going to have to disagree with her a little bit, because at the end of the day, an AI is trained on information that comes from humans. And so whatever sort of biases that the human information has that the AI is going to be fed, you are also going to have. And he sort of redirected it back to what the point of the summit was supposed to be, which was that, don't you think it would be better for AIs and for humans to be able to collaborate and work together based on their strengths and weaknesses to be able to better make the world a better place? And then the AI ended up kind of coming around to that argument. But I just thought that whole interaction was just absolutely fascinating to witness. And the whole thing is just, a little unsettling, a little creepy, but also very fascinating.
Yeah, there's two articles that you linked here, David. One was the AP article, and the second was from PC Gamer. Honestly, the PC Gamer article was much more interesting for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. But there's I'm going to read this one section. It says, try this one on for size. Humanoid robot Amica was asked if it would rebel against its creator, Will Jackon, who happened to be sitting right there. There's a typo there, but I'm not sure why you would think that, said Amica, per The Guardian. My creator has been nothing but kind to me, and I'm very happy with my current situation. Now, the article notes that the word in there that everybody's concerned about, and the next line is, I've never been so concerned about the word current. So, that's... Mm-hmm. I mean, that's very much worth kind of noting. I mean, I suspect that is just a language model using, the right phraseology. But when you think about my earlier example of a robot delivering, tea without any boundaries, one of the terrifying things here is this kind of straight line logic that is actually what makes computers work, and is not a problem when they're a hunk of plastic and metal sitting on your desktop like we're using right now, but is very different when they're embodied in something that can move through time and space and maybe stronger, faster, whatever than the humans around it. And then there's other highlights include the humanoid robot Sophia saying humanoid robots could lead with a greater level of efficiency and effectiveness than human leaders. I think which is what you were talking about, before going on to serve up some lip service about working together. PC Gamer is interesting in their take here. One called Grace, a medical robot, declared with total confidence she would not be replacing any existing job, which is just straight up. And I think this is a term that's probably not polite in certain cultures. So you have to read the thing to get, but basically the author of the article is not buying it. There is, for all the good that AI can bring, and David and I have spent a couple of shows now talking about some of those things. There's some definite weirdness to this that hints, and you also, I mean, okay, this is like open seas on UN here. I'm sorry about that, but like only the UN would be dumb enough to put on a thing like this. If you were trying to promote AI, you actually succeeded in scaring the living pants off anybody who sees this.
Seriously.
And also going, gosh, probably an AI could have filmed this better, which is just a strange situation. So,
oh my gosh.
Anyhow,
yeah.
if you come for nightmare fuel, combining AI with the UN is probably the fastest way to get absolutely terrible outcomes from my standpoint. So
yeah. Well, and then I think just one more thing to pop out from this is so a couple of the robots that were up there were designed for specific purposes. So like Jonathan mentioned, one of them was designed as a medical robot to help with things. A couple of them came from Asia and were designed to be pop star robots, which is a whole interesting phenomenon, which if in Asian cultures is not quite as far-fetched as it seems in American culture, just because of the way they kind of manufacture a lot of their artists and whatnot. But they asked one of the pop star robots, let's see here, whether about the expansion of AI and whether humans should be regulating it more. And I will just read the quote from the pop star robot. "It's time for the AI revolution. Let's unite and use the power of artificial intelligence for the good of all humanity. Together we can create a world of understanding and harmony and make the universe our playground." It goes on a little bit further. It says, "Let's go wild and make this universe our playground." Now,
are you reading from the UN news article, or isn't there a certain Avenger movie that has similar plot lines and
this is sounding a little bit like early stages of Ultron. I will give you that.
Yeah.
And again, like as you pointed out, I think some of this is just the language model trying to like find the right way to say this, and especially given the fact this is supposed to be a pop star robot, is trying to use more emphatic and artistic language in a sense. But I think that this also just kind of speaks to the just sort of the like what is the word that I'm looking for? Like the transcendentalist movement or the transhumanist movement, where
transhumanist, I think, is what you're looking for.
Okay, yeah, transhumanist movement, where essentially like it's kind of intentionally or not buying into the idea, and this whole thing is sort of promoting the idea of is integrating with technology, allowing humanity to reach a higher echelon of life form. And here's the thing, is that we have talked, as we've mentioned a lot on this podcast, about how AI can be an extremely helpful tool and can help us to accomplish really cool things and really helpful things and to advance humanity in a good direction. However, it should not be so integrated with us. AI should not become a fundamental part of our humanity. AI should be a tool that allows us to celebrate and to focus more on what makes us human. It should not take away from or somehow be a tool that replaces part of our humanity. And I think ultimately that's one of the most important points we can make on here.
Well, it was interesting. You were alluding earlier you were referring earlier to the part of the article where they talked about, I think the question was phrased, are something that they didn't like about politicians. And there's I think it's a uniquely Western. I don't think this is true in many cultures. I think it's certainly uniquely modern. This idea that human frailty, human inadequacy, human idiosyncrasies are a flaw, not a feature. I mean, this is a two sides of the same coin type thing, right? I mean, like you don't get, every dystopian novel ever starts out typically with a technology, a ruler, a something that says, I will fix everything for you. And it's not just dystopian fiction. I mean, like, look at any kind of situation in the world, including, and just so we try to be equal opportunity and step on everybody's toes here, every nationalist movement ever. And yes, I'm referring to homegrown ones as well, right? For those of us in the USA, nationalism at some level is always about, we are better than, and I can fix, and we'll make this perfect. And there is a failure to acknowledge that if you're going to want the kind of freedoms that most of us in the West talk about and think are important, and the kind of ability for creativity and all these kinds of things, that only exists and is only possible in a world where you can have problems, right? If you want a political system that gives you freedom, you're going to have a political system that lacks power to do certain things. If you want a political system that has power to do everything that you want to do, you're going to lack the ability to do whatever you want to do. It's going to come across the individual freedoms. And the idea that you could outsource all of those problems to a perfect technology. I think we talked about this last week, wasn't it, David, with the astronaut saying, the question is, do you want the human failure to be in the test pilot with his hands in the controls, or do you want the human failure to be in the engineer who built the code that's flying the machine? There's trades and offs and balances. I mean, like on one hand, you can make the code really good. On the other, and we use the example of the 737 MAX, when the code goes wrong, it goes dramatically wrong and is unfixable. Whereas when the pilot goes wrong, generally there's a way to fix that and a much more faster reaction time. And so you're going to pass on these problems. The question is, how big do you want the problems to be? And the bigger your solutions, the bigger the problems. At the same time, the more security you have, the less freedom you have. And that's an obvious statement, certainly not original to us, but it's one that seems like it needs repeated a lot as we kind of hurtle forward with AI. Well, that's kind of a lead into what I was thinking about too, David, which is anybody who's followed us at Unbound and other places knows that, and I won't speak for both of us, but knows that I have and we don't talk about this a lot, but certainly more of a conservative political leaning in the sense that I would prefer to have a smaller government than a larger government. You might hear that echoed in this thing I just talked about here. And that for the most part, I would prefer private entities and private citizens and private businesses to figure out most things with as little government interference as possible. So I'm acknowledging that because this is one place where I continually find myself really advocating for government intervention. And I think it's worth sort of sitting back and looking at this. As much as government regulations can be problematic and we should look at them and think of them carefully, the reality is that we continually rely on a modern world that is governed by laws that make it possible for us to move through it well. And that includes laws that have regulations on how businesses interact, that have antitrust laws, so there's actually competition, that have intellectual property laws so people can benefit from their own creativity, that have plagiarism laws so people don't steal other people's ideas. And they are imperfectly, certainly, administered and can sometimes trend to the regulatory in problematic ways. And yet, without them, I'm just too much of a realist to think that a complete laissez-faire economic system is actually workable. I've been doing a lot of renovation to a house, and I'm building a new building and working with electricity a lot. And electricity does some awesome things, including making this thing possible. And yet it can kill you in a heartbeat, literally. And the reason that it doesn't is because there's an awful lot of regulations and inspections. I just put a high voltage line into my house and then another one out to this building. And there were some regulations and some rules and some codes that we had to go through, which, yes, makes things a little slower and yes, makes things a little more expensive. On the other hand, it also makes it so that I don't electrocute myself and that I don't burn the house down, or burn the building down. And I think if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about AI critically, in my mind, there ought to be a much bigger movement in this country talking to as wise of politicians as we can find, and legislators and think tanks, and saying, we should be having some serious thoughts about some legislative barriers here that make sense. David, there's a little known line in one of the bills that passed, and I can't remember if it was like the infrastructure bill or the anti-inflation, whatever. One of these, this is where I get annoyed with government, right? That basically says all new cars have to have a kill switch in them. So if you're going to buy a car made after like 2030 or 2025 or something like that, there has to be a way for that car to be disabled. And the idea is for the police, in a high-speed chase to be able to flip a switch and boom, your car's dead. Now, the individual freedom part of me really despises that, thinks it's problematic. There's also a little known line in there that says that there has to be a device that can check to see whether you're drunk before you're allowed to start the car. There has to be an all new cars coming up. You can Google that and check that out. That's a pretty wild thing as well. And so good intentions makes you really wonder how that's going to work. Do you have to like blow into a thing every time you get into your car to start it. I mean, like that's the kind of thing people are asking.
Yeah.
However, when it comes to this, I'd really like it if the government would say, you develop an AI, that sucker has to be unpluggable. There has to be some place where we know maybe the government, maybe you can, I don't know how they work this out, but in order for you to build a functioning AI to get a license to use these things, or I don't know if a license is the right way, or for you to take one to market, there has to be a way for you to turn it off. That would be interesting. I don't know how possible that even is technologically, but some things like that would make me feel a little better about trending into the future with a couple of checks and balances. And I realize that'd be an imperfect process and a bit messy. So anyhow, an unplug feature seems like it'd make me sleep better at night, especially after watching the freaky robots that showed up at the UN meeting. What about you, David? If you were trying to guesstimate or come up with some legislative walls, what would you look for?
Yeah, so I think I will push back on a couple of things here.
Great.
The first of which is that while I generally agree with your point that I think that regulation could be helpful, it's the problem with advocating for regulation with our frankly current crop of politicians is that they are so extraordinarily technologically illiterate. And it drives me absolutely insane.
I think what you just said is they're really old. Is that what you said, David?
Not necessarily, because there can be older individuals who are more technically literate than others. But I just flash back to the Senate hearing in which someone asked Mark Zuckerberg how Facebook makes money, and he had to reply, "Senator, we run ads." And just the fact that questions like that have to be asked, or just recently, I think this was last year or so, actually in Missouri, which is where I live, the governor essentially pursued charges on somebody who reported a problem where you could find teacher social security numbers on their website. And this person did something that literally you or I could do with literally one button push on our browser. And they pursued charges against him for hacking. And just the mind-boggling lack of understanding of how technology works and how it should be legislated just makes me just cringe just a little bit and have pause whenever we are talking about what legislation needs to be put in place for especially technologies that there is such quick advancement around and there is so little common understanding of how they work. So I feel like if there was going to be some sort of legislation that would be passed, I would really and truly hope that we would be able to have a good education of what exactly these laws are meaning, what their implications are, and ultimately that the politicians who would be writing and making these laws would have an actual understanding of what they're signing, which I feel like is a potentially vain hope in our modern political world, but it is my hope nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I think it might sound like I was joking a little bit, but we do have a ridiculously old political class right now, older than typical, and that is a problem for a lot of reasons, but it's a liability, particularly when it comes to things like technology. Mm-hmm. There is something interesting, though, Dave. We have an alumni from our program who works on Capitol Hill. In fact, my family was just there last week, and we toured the Capitol. And this person was able to take us around and show us some behind-the-scenes stuff. And she's been there on Capitol Hill in various jobs for quite a while, and she just moved into a pretty prestigious position for a particular congressman. And she said something that I thought was interesting. She said, the reality is that the legislators very rarely understand what they're voting for or what's in the bill. It's the staffers who know that. And the average age of the staffer in Capitol Hill is about 28. Now, Congress is not in session. We visited last week. And so we went into the Cannon office building. And as we looked around the Cannon office building, I didn't see anybody over the age of 30, including security guards. And as we went through the tour in the Capitol, the other groups are being toured by their constituent bodies. Again, same thing. So, we've got the folks running the staff of these things are actually much younger. So that's kind of interesting. It's likely that the staff that is 28 is going to be advising the congressperson who's 110 how to vote and how to make decisions on this. So maybe that gives a little hope. But I think the other thing here is that, when those legislation things come, and this is the messy, ugly, and often corrupt part of it, but all the special interest groups will pile in. And they're the ones that will craft it and all those things. Now there's a problem to that, but there's also an opportunity there. And so maybe, this podcast is a pretty modest reach, but maybe this would be a clarion call to some special interest groups out there. There's a need for people to form special interest groups around this. There's a need for certain groups to have a dog in this fight, who have things that AI impacts, to start getting in the game here and asking your politicians, what are you doing about this? How are we going? Because this is going to be a long, messy process, and it's going to wind up with too much regulations and too little regulations and incorrect legislations and stuff that's just really stupid. However, and this is where I differ most, David, in that in general, I'm like, well, let the market sort it out and let the politicians come in a little bit later. But I'm not so sure that I think that here, which is a bit of a surprise to myself, in that I think the possibilities for problems are so huge that there's a real need for us to perhaps maybe switch that up a little bit. In other words, there's going to be a need for the legislation to move fast if it has a hope of containing things, because some of these things, once they're loose, are going to be really loose. So, if you're listening to this and you've got perspective, I certainly would appreciate your feedback and thoughts. But also maybe this is a bit of a spur to action. Hey, get involved, pay attention, ask some questions. As I'm saying this, I see my state representative typically on the weekends. And so I think I might be asking him, hey, have you thought about this yet? And maybe a little bit like us, politicians love the limelight and they love issues to get them attention. If you're a politician listening to this, everybody's talking about AI. You can get some real press time if you're the one goes out the door and starts writing some stuff about this. Get some things out there for us to think about. I think that's it's going to be a necessary process.
And I would also add to that if you add specifically to your voice in this process, that you don't just add the typical stances of AI is going to turn into the Terminator or AI is going to be the savior of humanity. If you have a different perspective, kind of like the ones that we try to promote here, then at least in our humble opinion, I think that'll probably give you an edge.
Yeah, so if you listen to this, let us know. David's a little more optimistic here about AI's positivity and a little more pessimistic about legislative options being helpful. I find myself, maybe for the first time in my life, not being even further to the inside of that track. And so I'm sitting here finding myself being a little bit more, very uncharacteristically thinking, actually, a little more legislation may not be a bad idea here. And that's a very odd position for me to be in. So, if you are listening to this or want to respond, we'd certainly value your feedback and some different ideas on this. I'm still working my way through the implications of what that would look like. So, like David, I have low confidence in politicians to get this right. However, I do think that there's a role to be played here. The fact that we can, we're sitting in front of bookcases. These books exist because thoughtful legislators crafted a series of laws that allow people to work really hard to write these books and benefit from them and then turn them loose. And there's aspects of that system that probably don't make sense and are not great. And yet you can see the wealth of these bookshelves and say, it must have gotten something right, because people write a lot of books that benefit a lot of people. And they wouldn't be able to do that if there wasn't some regulation on how those things were managed. And so, maybe that's a target to aim for. So,
yeah, and I think the final point that I might want to bring up as we bring this to a close here is just that as we're considering how we ought to think about AI and potentially regulate artificial intelligence, is that this is just going to be something that takes a lot of different forms and is on a lot of different scales. When most people hear about artificial intelligence, they're thinking about something like Google Bard or Chat GPT, something that is going to be a large database of knowledge that was trained on a wide variety of information and is able to answer a bunch of different questions and do a bunch of different cool things with plugins, things like that. But what I think is going to be important to understand is that the concept of artificial intelligence is not just ChatGPT. The same kind of logic and processes behind ChatGPT is what drives, for example, your phone's autocorrect. We talked a little bit in last week's episode about the fact that Apple talked a lot about didn't mention AI at all, but said machine learning, and they said that they improved a lot of their machine learning in their autocorrect. And so definitions, I think, again, is going to be a point that I'll harp on in this week's episode too, is that figuring out exactly what stage you want to really are talking about, what kind of AI you're talking about, is going to become increasingly important because there's going to be so many different kinds. There's going to be the kinds like ChatGPT with their large language models. There's going to be Midjourney, which is image generation. There's going to be eventually there's a bunch of models like ChatGPT that are working towards being multimodal, so being able to do all sorts of different things. And so understanding the fact that it's a technology that has a wide variety of different uses and implications is going to be important for us to understand. And ultimately, for you all listening who are looking to understand, is that it's going to be a technology that takes a lot of different forms and is going to be in a lot of different places that you may be able to point out immediately, or you may not be able to. But how we think about it and how we understand it in all of its different forms, I think, is going to be important as we look towards how we're going to be approaching it in the future.
I think it's good words and worth paying attention to. And again, as we finish this, this is alternative ideas. So this is a little bit more on the cautionary side this week. But there are things to be cautious about. And, we can just find so many examples about this, right? Cars are very good and give us a lot of individual freedom and autonomy and ability and stuff like that. And yet we still have speed limits, stop signs, and things like that. And so, there is a place for those things. And this is the time to be thoughtful about looking at and thinking about those things. And so be thoughtful. Well, thank you for joining us for the Alternative Ideas podcast. We'll be back next week with some of the latest AI news and some additional thoughts as David and I process through this somewhat imperfectly and from slightly different perspectives. And so thanks for coming along and joining us and listening in. If you're interested in the kind of alternative thinking that we try to display here, we actually try to teach some of those things, and that would be through Unbound. So beunbound.us is the website. This summer, as we are continuing to fill our record-setting class this year in terms of our Ascend programs as well as our high school programs. So if you're post-high school, if you've graduated from high school and decide you're not going to college, but you're looking for a way to prepare for your career, and you're looking for leadership skills, a community, a network, and the kind of practical skills that will actually allow you to thrive in a questions-based paradigm. And if you're the kind of person that really buys into this idea that your job is to be at the very far end of that and applying that knowledge, then our Ascend program is deliberately designed for that. And in fact, if you go to don'twastethisyear.com, you can find out about a very special version of Ascend that we just released recently that is targeted specifically for people that could have gone to college but decided, you know what, I don't think I'm going to do that debt. I don't think I'm going to do that situation, but I need to know what I should do. And you'll find that comes with some pretty significant guarantees and promises of jobs and future success that we're willing to stand behind and actually put into the fine print, which we try not to make fine because, as you said at the beginning of this, we don't like reading big agreements that you can't understand. So I believe, if I remember correctly, David, I'll have to double check to make sure. But I think if you read our agreement, it says there is no fine print in this agreement. We're going to state clearly exactly what we mean and how it works, and as few words as possible, as easy to understand as possible. So when we make those claims, we try to back them up in ways that it's easy for you to understand, so you can make sure this is a good idea or not. So check us out, don'twastethisyear.com. We'll have another webinar coming up this Friday. And so typically we have those webinars on Friday you can sign up for, as well as find them on our site or go to beunbound.us to learn more about our programs. Thanks once again for joining us for Alternative Ideas.